Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to AMO's expert panel on electronic attendance at meetings by members of council, local boards, and committees. My name is Nigel Bellchamber. I'm your moderator for today, and I have with me three well-known experts in this field. I'm going to introduce them in order and then ask them to speak, but also ask them questions that have been posed to us by individuals over the last 24 hours. My first introduction will be Fred Dean, my colleague. Fred and I have been working together for pretty well 20 years now, doing training for AMO and on our own for municipal councils. Fred's been a municipal solicitor. He's practiced law in Ontario for over 40 years. And he's seen it, fixed it, solved it, all of those different things. And Fred's going to be the first one up. But before he comes up, I'd like to introduce the other two panelists, Jody Johnson. Jody is Director of Legal Services with the region of Halton. Now that may sound like she works with a large municipality, but let me tell you, Jody has been CAO Clerk of the municipality of French River. There aren't too many that are smaller than French River or much more remote. So Jody has the experience of large, small, rural, urban, and the north. Jody also is a solicitor, as I referenced earlier. She articled with the City of Windsor. She's also worked with the Ministry of Municipal Affairs as a municipal advisor out of the Sudbury office. So she understands, again, very much the needs of smaller, rural, and northern municipalities. And also, last but not least, is Stephen O'Brien. Stephen's a general manager and clerk with the City of Guelph. But for those of you that know Stephen and or his family connections, municipal work is in his blood. His dad is a former municipal colleague, former city manager of Mississauga, but Stephen comes by his own, his position by his own qualifications, experience, and talents. Stephen began his municipal career working with, as an intern, funded by Municipal Affairs, worked with AMCTO, and he too has worked in rural and somewhat remote municipalities. I think part of your internship, Stephen, involved the municipality of Northern Bruce Peninsula with
that's right.
Lion's Head, and if any of you know Tobermory, that's where Northern Bruce Peninsula ends and Georgian Bay begins in a way. So I'm with, having said all that, I'm going to start with Fred, ask Fred to give a brief overview of Bill 187, what that's done for the Municipal Act, what it means for the sector. Then I'm going to ask Jody and Stephen to speak about their experiences with their first meetings, and then we'll be open for questions. So Fred, over to you.
Thanks, Nigel. I have to admit, listening to both Stephen and Jody talk about the first meetings that they had under this new world that we're in was really interesting, and I'm looking forward to them sharing it with the rest of the group today. Some valuable lessons to be learned. I wanted to go back and just put things into context, if I could, for just a minute. Until about 2 years ago, council meetings had to be in the council chamber, and everyone had to be there, and there was no exception to that. And then Bill 68 came along and introduced the concept of allowing some members to electronically attend a council meeting. A public meeting had to be public, but it couldn't be a majority. The majority still had to be in the council chamber. And if a municipality wanted to use this provision, it had to amend its procedure bylaw to allow it. My talking with people around the province, it hasn't had a large uptick. So we haven't seen a lot of that happening to date. Then we come to Bill 187, and it has some really significant changes in it. Firstly, it does not provide for electronic meetings. There's nothing in that legislation, in the amendment to Section 239, that allows for electronic meetings. Rather, it states that members may electronically attend and that they will be counted in quorum. So they may electronically attend and they will be counted in quorum, unlike under Bill 68, where those attending electronically were not counted in quorum. This applies not only to public meetings, but it also applies to closed meetings. So the rules are significantly different than from what we've seen before. And the meetings under Section 239 of the Act, all of the provisions of Section 239 in terms of subject matter, etc., are still in place. This means then that one member, all the way up to all members, may attend the meeting, the council meeting, electronically. And I think the province was very wise in drafting it this way, to not call it electronic meetings, not assuming that everyone was going to be attending electronically. Like Bill 68, Bill 187 requires amendments to the procedure bylaw of each municipality. And there may be a discretion, but I think there's really no discretion to this. I think you have to be doing this. And they will be implemented by the amendments, and they will remain in effect until the emergency is declared over. And given that background, Nigel, maybe we can hear the experiences of Jody and Stephen.
Thanks for that overview, Fred. Stephen, since your meeting was, your meeting was first, why don't you tell us how it went and what techniques you used?
Sure, thanks, Nigel. And thanks for the intro there, Fred. In terms of the background of legislation, our experience in Guelph began on Monday night at 6 p.m. Actually, it probably began sometime late last week, when Bill 187 was introduced in the legislature and received passage through that process. We had some signals from our members of council, our mayor, that wanted to have a meeting shortly to deal with some emergency related matters. And so we turned immediately our attention to Bill 187. I would say, and I'm being completely honest and frank, first of all kudos to my team at the City of Guelph that really pulled together, the legislative services team and our IT partners at Guelph. We're fortunate to have both of those in-house, really pulled together and made this work. Admittedly, it was a bit of a patchwork situation. We used WebEx, which is a Cisco product, for all members to connect in from home. So we have a 13-member council. We had 12 members connecting in from home. There was a skeleton staff in the chambers along with the mayor. So the mayor, the clerk, deputy clerk, one other staff person from the city clerk's office, and we had members of our executive team and our city treasurer. One of the laptops in the council chambers was basically the host, and the other one was really just a microphone to pick up the audio from the council chambers. So we're fortunate that our council chambers is wired, so we can broadcast and speak it sort of over the loudspeaker, the microphones that members of council use. So one laptop used to host the meeting and the other laptop used to capture the audio from the discussion. Everyone muted their mics. What I can say is it went really well. We were admittedly going into it much like I'm sure a lot of our friends and colleagues around the province are. We were a little bit reticent going in, but it turned out to be very well. We live streamed through the video of our council chambers, so you could see a snapshot, a live view of the chambers with those in attendance, and the screen, a projector screen behind, showed those that were attending remotely. We also are fortunate to still have Rogers Local Cable as a partner in Guelph, and so they also broadcast the meeting as well. So a bit of good fortune, a bit of patchwork, a bit of people pulling together, and we were pretty happy with the outcome.
Great. So you had a number of technologies that you were able to employ together in order to make it work. Jody, tell us about the region.
We had, our council had 2 meetings last, on Wednesday past, so just 2 days ago. It seems like a long time already. We, like Stephen, started very quickly last week when the legislation was released. Council already had a regular meeting scheduled for this past Wednesday, the 25th. The agenda had been out and published and posted on our website. And so what council had participated in on Wednesday, we held our meeting via Zoom, much like this meeting today. And all members of council participated electronically. None of them were present in council chambers. So the reason we had 2 meetings, we had a special meeting at 9:15 a.m. And at that meeting, the only item on the agenda was the consideration of a council report and bylaw, putting forward amendments to the procedural bylaw to permit electronic participation. And so that meeting was very short. We did keep all formalities of the meeting, playing of O Canada, full roll call, all of the things that would normally take place on our agendas. And then that meeting was adjourned and the next meeting was started. What we decided to do with our clerk's office staff, with the agenda that had already been published, was to withdraw that agenda. And you'll see that notation on the region's website where the agendas and minutes are posted. And it was replaced with a different agenda with a shortened order of proceedings and order of business. And it proceeded electronically. We had presentations from 2 members of staff, the treasurer and the medical officer of health. Council was interactive and asked questions of both staff delegations. In the chamber itself was the clerk and committee assistant, myself, our Commissioner of Legislative Services and Corporate Counsel, the Chief Administrative Officer, and the IT staff. And like Stephen, we are fortunate to have IT staff in-house. I have said many times this week, they are the rock stars of this week. They've really pulled together and made things happen and helped those of us who maybe aren't as technologically inclined get things done. And so that's how that went.
Great.
And if I can, the videos are posted on our website. People can go and see the agenda materials as well as the videos of the meeting.
Okay, so you two benefit from some reasonably sophisticated or comprehensive technology and that already existed for your councils. Okay, that's
Nigel, if I can jump in, one thing I will add on that is we certainly, Jody and I, have benefited from a little bit of a technology in-house, but one thing that we really focused on was setting some ground rules and some tips. So we can go over those through the questions, but really I can jump through some things pretty quickly. Set ground rules early. The mayor turned to myself right as the meeting kicked off, and we talked about things like raising your hand to speak, raising your hand to vote. Now, we had a video conference, so that made sense for us. We talked about muting your device so that there's to reduce background noise. That can work on a teleconference or a video conference. We kept it light. I like Jody's analogy of the first meeting being just to amend that procedural bylaw. So keep it light, keep it to the point and succinct. We sent protocols to members of council in advance that articulated some of those things like raise your hand to vote. And we also opened up a test window during the day of. So from 1 to 2 p.m., we let members of council connect in, try out their system, play with their devices, whether it's phone or video conference. And that was a really big help. We always made sure we had less than quorum in that drop-in window,
Yes.
just to make sure that we were following those rules. But that allowed for us to really get all 12 members that were connecting remotely really comfortable being at home and connecting into it.
right. Jody, were you able to see how all of your members were voting as well by raising their hands?
A couple different things. Like Stephen, we had some tips and practice windows beforehand. Not all of the members participated by video. Some of them participated with the telephone in option only. So the clerk asked the question if there were, in terms of voting, yeas and nays, and you could see some of the members who did raise their hand, but we did rely as well on the verbal statement of members in terms of voting, which you would do at a meeting sometimes anyways. We didn't have, there was no call for a recorded vote, but that's also one possibility, is if you're doing a meeting, whether it's by telephone or a Zoom or a WebEx or a combination of video and audio, council could decide they would like recorded votes on one or more items, and then you have certainty of that recording of the vote as well.
Fred, I've heard you speak about this. Let's assume that everybody's on a conference call. Could you do it other than by recorded vote?
I think it's really difficult, and I think it goes to the whole issue of transparency as well. You're not only doing this for the people at the meeting, the members and the staff. I think if it's being recorded or people from the outside are looking in, I think they are entitled to see how individual members are voting, similar to them being in a council chamber for a regular meeting, as we've known it. People can see how votes are taken. So I might err on the side of doing some more recorded votes than I would, particularly smaller communities that this may be of significance for them. Again, it's transparency and it's accountability.
Well, particularly where people can't see them. You might even have to go so far as periodically through the meeting, especially if you just barely made quorum on an electronic or on a telephone call, to make sure that you still had quorum. Sounds like nitpicking, but people can be lost in some of those small communities in terms of the connectivity, because we've heard of lots of challenges. I've got a number of questions here that we'll need to move quickly through. The first one comes from Vicki Gertson-Cook, who is the clerk treasurer of Plummer Additional Township. So that's a relatively small municipality. And Vicki says, we have problems with connectivity. And in fact, our council chambers doesn't permit 2-meter separation to allow for the public to attend even though they normally don't attend. If they wanted to, we couldn't fit people into the council chambers and have physical distancing as recommended. So we're checking into Zoom, we're checking into WebEx, but we're told that our internet speed is going to be a problem. As far as having a meeting open to the public or providing public accessibility, what's your suggested route, given that we've got some people that are high risk on council, and even if they're not in the council chambers, we have some difficulty having physical distance separation for people. So what other tools might we use for accountability and transparency? Fred, you want to start with that?
Well, I was going to ask Stephen and Jody in terms of how they dealt with the public in terms of the two meetings, the special meeting that Jody had and the regular meeting that Stephen had. How was the public involved?
Jody, did the public attend your meeting?
We did not have public attend our meeting because our regional headquarters is currently closed to members of the public. So there were no public attendees. Our agendas are posted on our website. That was made available. We also permit for written delegations. If people wanted to delegate on any item on the agenda, they could email their delegation or submit it in paper form to the clerk. We did not have the opportunity for live delegations at the special meeting or the first regular meeting, but that certainly is something that is being considered and explored, just simply to see what's technologically possible going forward. There are technological solutions. It's you want to think about your procedures and your parameters around that, but certainly having the ability to accept written delegations would keep that open. And then having, if possible, a recording of the meeting posted on your website or available to the public after, promoting it through your social media, doing whatever you can to get it out to your local community also helps with that openness and accountability.
So when you gave notice of your meeting or your meetings, you indicated there where the public could observe, where they could log in or tune in?
I'd have to go back and double check, but that certainly I would anticipate will be available going forward. I don't have off the top of my head what exact wording we had on our website, but our agenda material and times were posted.
Okay. Stephen, were people allowed into your council chambers? Who was there and how did people know where to observe?
Yeah, we didn't have any attendees in the council chamber either. So City Hall was closed and has been for some time. My mind goes to, I mean, we're all going to have to think creative in this time. So my mind goes to the ability for people to, so all of what Jody had said, an agenda posted, the minutes available after the fact, some form of recording of the meeting, I think is going to be really beneficial and really important in terms of ensuring that the public has the ability to view and watch what decisions were made by council, whether that's video or audio. Going back to Vicky's question, my mind goes to, you know, she's explained that she's got sort of connectivity issues in her community and things like that. Don't think that a remote participation by your members has to be video. It doesn't have to look like what we're looking at right now. It can very much be teleconference. And teleconference is a really good option for people to consider. And what I would be doing is asking whatever provider you have for that teleconference, if there's a way to get the recording of it so that you can post it. Is there a way for individuals to dial in and listen without actually actively participating in the meeting? And then finally, what I would say is start thinking creatively. We're thinking this way now in Guelph about, you know, how would we handle delegates? So we can't have them come in, because I think what is absolutely critical is that we're listening to public health authorities in this unique time. Social distancing and that 2-meter separation that Vicki alluded to is critical. But how can we get the public to participate? We're contemplating, for example, amending further our bylaw for emergency sections so that we can dial out to a delegate. And you're going to have to set rules. Well, we might try once, we might try a second time, and if that doesn't work, we'll go to the next delegate, then we might come back to them and try again. But those are the kind of things that you're going to have to be creative with. So I think there's ways for us to do this, and we will no doubt learn as a sector as we go along.
Has either of you considered amending the procedure bylaw to reduce the ability of the public to appear as delegations during the emergency?
I don't think we've had discussions at Guelph specifically about reducing public participation. I think it's just it's different in how they participate. So we're used to the context of participating in public meetings under the guise of they come into the chambers, they approach the podium, they're given 5 minutes, they have their chance to dialogue with council or present their case to council on whatever the given matter is. It may look more like us now reaching out to them via telephone and letting them participate that way. That's sort of the way that we're looking at going, but there will probably need to be amendments to whether it's the procedural bylaw or some of those sort of protocol or policy documents that exist in the back end that sort of support what we do in the chambers. I think we will see those kind of changes for sure.
And that there may not be the capacity to do that in all 444 municipalities, so you're going to have to proceed accordingly. This one comes from Paula Rock, who's the Clerk Manager Planning Services in the town of Espanola. She said the Act under Bill 187 doesn't change the location of our meetings nor the ability of the public to attend, but do you think a stream meeting posted for public viewing will meet this requirement? But if we don't have the ability to stream this meeting, what options do you think we have? What would be best efforts? Fred, you want to jump on that for a minute?
Well, Paul's got to be pretty happy with the discussion so far, because both Stephen and Jody, I think, have talked about what's being done in their municipalities, larger, sophisticated municipalities, and they're saying you've got to adjust to make it work for you. One of the things, when I listened to the first part, if you're a small municipality, don't think you have to open the doors to let people into your council chamber for a council meeting. Your municipality offices are closed, so you have to be looking at other alternatives. And Stephen's right. You've got to be creative in how you do it. You have to look at various elements of it. This issue of notice, you have to have a place for the meeting. In most cases, is going to continue to be the council chamber, as Stephen described. But I would make clear in your notice that this meeting is going to be attended electronically by members and staff. There will be, and if you have 2 people in the council chamber, or a couple, as Jody did, say that in your notice and tell people, here's how you participate. You're going to be able to see the video. If you want to be a delegation, look on our website. We're going to tell you how to do that in writing, or we may begin the reach out concept that Stephen's talking about. Don't scrimp on the notice. Tell as much as you can, and I think that will satisfy any test in terms of going forward, that you're working with the technology that you have in your community. And your technology is very different than Jody and Stephen's in a lot of places in Ontario. I read an article just the other day talking about bandwidth and the importance of bandwidth, not only in a municipal context, but at home. And one of the suggestions is don't run your microwave when you're doing a video. Well, that's probably not important in municipal context, but look at ways that you can keep the bandwidth up and maintain the meeting as it goes along, and make sure you don't lose your quorum, as Nigel said earlier.
You're going to have to show me, Fred, how to watch Netflix on the microwave. Jody?
I think the other thing, and I don't disagree with what Fred has said, I think the other thing that's really important is document what you're doing and what the thought process is and what the decision-making process is. Just you have a record to go back, especially if as we go through this, people are going to look at what worked, what didn't, but also you have a record of here's what we consciously thought about in terms of our openness and our transparency and our accountability. And for example, if even though your building is not open to the public, here's who was physically in the chambers. The door was open. Here's how we gave the notice. Here's what we considered. Here's what we decided to do. And the other thing is thinking about that issue of location of meeting. I know some people have asked questions about if you're having your members participate electronically, what is the location of the meeting? I know for us, as I said, our clerk was in council chambers, and that's where the meeting originated from or was hosted. So that was the location of the meeting. Most procedural bylaws do set out, as required in the Municipal Act, the location of the meetings, but there's also provision in the Municipal Act in an emergency to change that location of the meeting. So just again, as Fred says, make sure you're clear to the public where the location is, where you're hosting it, if it's via teleconference or by a WebEx. My suggestion, we're just going to keep to wherever the clerk is the place of the hosting of the meeting.
Yeah, the only other thing I would add, going back to Paul's question, I don't read Bill 187 to say that it has to be video. And when I read Paul's question about stream, I think that there's a connotation there that it has to be a video stream. I don't think it does. The way that I read it, a teleconference can be a remote meeting as much as a video conference can be a remote meeting. So, and I think that will address a lot of the questions of our friends that are and colleagues that are in perhaps places where bandwidth and broadband capacity is a question.
Right. I've posed the question to a couple of people who are checking into it is, can you have a conference call that has 5 people who have the ability to speak, or 6, and numerous people who can attend but will be guaranteed to be on mute, with mute controlled by the clerk or the clerk, practically speaking. And they're saying we're checking in to see how simple that technology can be. Can Bell conferencing, for instance, just the basic conferencing, provide that? And that might solve it. But as you point out, Jody, if the best you're going to be able to do is to provide an audio recording of the meeting when it's over, let people know in advance that that's what you're going to do from an accountability point of view. Should be no surprises. And if you have to close your office and your building for safety purposes, make it clear that's why it's closed. It's very clear.
Nigel, can I add one more comment?
Yes, Fred.
Don't rush. You don't have to have this special meeting this week or early next week. I know one municipality's probably not going to hold this special council meeting till late April. They want to see what the technology is and how they're going to be able to set it up. Get it lined up as much as you possibly can. Make sure your bylaw is really good and really consistent with the goals that you're after and that reflect the practices in your community.
Right. Craig Jeffrey, the clerk of Seguin, asked a similar question, but he ended with the question, have you heard any rumors that the province may be considering further amendments to change this requirement? I think the answer is no. And in fact, Jody, the action that was taken today by the minister with respect to conservation authorities, I think gives us an indication that what they've done for municipalities is what they think is sufficient in this circumstance. Can you elaborate on that?
Sure. And actually, I think it was yesterday, the letter's dated yesterday. I saw it this morning that Minister Urick at the Ministry of the Environment, Conservation and Parks has issued a direction to conservation authorities under the Conservation Authorities Act, giving very similar permissions for conservation authorities to amend their administrative or procedural bylaws to have meetings by electronic participation. So that was done through a directive rather than a reference to the Municipal Act or a change to the Conservation Authorities Act.
Right. So then that sparks the question, given that we have other local boards, the question was raised by John Sisson in Bracebridge. So how does this apply to library boards? Are they covered by the same legislation as municipalities, or are they different? Jody, you want to hit that?
Again, this is just my read, and I'm going to use the great lawyer line. I'm not giving anybody legal advice. I'm telling you what I see in the Act here. Okay. But when you look at Section 238 of the Municipal Act 2001, it contains a definition of local board right at the beginning of the section. And it says local board does not include police service boards or public library boards. And that's the section that contains these provisions to permit electronic meetings. That being said, I have not seen any directive out of the province that has been sent to library boards or is applicable to those boards. That doesn't mean it hasn't happened. I personally haven't seen one at this point in time.
You haven't seen anything, Stephen, with respect to library boards that you're aware of?
No, I'm in the same boat as Jody. I think she summarized that quite succinctly, yeah.
Okay. So this is from Jessica Rudy, who's Council Committee Support Specialist for the region of Waterloo. And they have a number of questions. They got together and came up with a long list. I'll cover some of them here. And maybe this one first to you, Fred. We've talked about this a bit. How do we let delegations participate without derailing the meeting? Can we restrict them during this period?
I think the answers that Stephen and Jody gave, I think in the world we're in, you've got to take delegations as written delegations. I think that's appropriate. It's the opportunity to be heard. If you can take that extra step that Stephen talked about, where you have them available and they can contact in or do a video in advance, that's fine. But I think for the time being, delegation should be in writing and should be provided in advance of the agenda being prepared and put out, so that the public will see it, as well as the members of council that can read what the delegation's about.
How about presentations from staff? Did you have any presentations, Stephen, other than from yourself? Or
no, we didn't have any specific presentations from staff. In fact, most of the staff in the room weren't even connected on the video conference. We were concerned about bandwidth issues, and we didn't want to run into issues with that. What I can say that we did do, or what I would contemplate in this is all of these tools. So let me say this: if you're using a video conference tool, a WebEx, a Zoom, a Microsoft Teams, whatever the tool is, a lot of them have the ability to share screens. So screen sharing is a great tool. You can use that. Again, I'll come back to a couple of things. Practice it, try it. I really like Fred's comments about you don't have to do this next week. You didn't have to do it this past week that you just come through. You can take the time to practice those things and get it right, so that when the time comes and there's a member of staff that has something urgent to present, and we all know a picture is worth 1,000 words. If that's the case and you're on a video conference type solution, then try the screen sharing options that are available through these various technology platforms.
Jody, this really brings to mind how important it is that everything that comes before council has a report behind it with a recommendation, and a recommendation phrased in effect in the form of a motion, so that there's limited what should we say, oral presentation or explanation other than to deal with questions that might arise from members of council. Have you contemplated that it might change in any way how recommendations are presented by staff to council at home?
For some municipalities, it may. In my municipality, that's the normal practice in any event, is there are written staff reports with recommendations, sometimes with presentations, sometimes without. We did have a staff presentation at the regular meeting this past Wednesday, and as Stephen said, the tool of screen sharing was used. The PowerPoint presentation was up on the screen, and the treasurer and chief financial officer was giving the presentation connected electronically and remotely. That person was not in council chambers, and they gave their presentation. So they had the oral presentation going along with the slides, and council asked questions of the staff member giving the presentation. But I think that's it. It's having the material available, doing as we always do in local government, having good, clear recommendations to council, providing advice with laying out recommendations, laying out background, laying out risks and challenges. I don't think any of that changes if we're doing it already. And perhaps, as you said, Nigel, it becomes more important if that is necessarily the structure of your reports and presentations to council, maybe thinking consciously about those things and how they're going to be presented.
So Fred, if you're just doing it by conference call, do you see that there's any risks if we start a conversation about a topic without a recommendation?
There's huge, even more than regularly. Absolutely. I mean, the basic rule is you need to have a motion on the floor to begin discussion on a matter. I think the chairs are going to have to be demonstrate a level of formality to ensure that is happening, and that everyone's speaking in order and going through the chair to make the comments. That's not a big issue in larger municipalities because it happens on a pretty regular basis, but it can be a bit of a challenge in smaller communities. There needs to be, I think, some training for heads of council and clerks in terms of how to conduct meetings online, some of the techniques that you can use to make it effective. It's going to be important to do that going forward, but this is a learning curve. I like Stephen's comments, but the fact we're going to have to try things and see if it works.
Okay. Yeah, Nigel, if I can jump in, there's a couple of bullet points there. We don't want to move on to other questions, no doubt, but a couple of bullet points in Jessica Rudy's questions from Waterloo. One of them was, which I think is really important, what happens when technology fails? I will give a shout out to one of my neighbors, and actually one of Waterloo's neighbors. Cambridge, Danielle Manton, the clerk in Cambridge, had some really good notes about they would try to reconnect an individual at one point, and if that doesn't work, they could take a recess. So be clear, be deliberative, articulate that in protocols and things like that to talk about what you would do if a member does get disconnected. The other one I really like is overall etiquette. And I'm sure the phone is on mute, but any concerns with background attire when using video conferencing. I can tell you right now, to Fred's point, we're in a unique time right now. At any moment right now, a 2-year-old could come running in this room right now that I'm in. And that's just the nature of the beast. That's the situation we're in. So I think we have to be amenable to those kind of things.
Good.
The made me smile a bit. One of the questions was had to do with, so how does the AODA, how do we deal with accessibility for those with disabilities? Or is this considered a situation where we have service disruption that might allow us to proceed without making accommodation for those who request it? Has either Jody or Stephen, has either of you had that issue discussed at your municipality yet on this? I know it's early for something like that. But.
Yeah, my response would be that I think we're still early days for that. It is important that the AODA does articulate the need for those service disruptions and notice of a service disruption. We often think about service disruption in physical buildings, physical structures. So for example, an elevator's out of service, what are the alternate options for individuals with disabilities to be able to access the building, get around the building? But the same thing holds true here. I mean, it may be worthwhile for you to give notice of a service disruption, which would prevent, for example, someone from physically coming into the building and delegating at the podium. But you know, this is where quite frankly, some of this technology actually bridges the gap a little bit in a way with those in our community with disabilities, because you know, video conferencing, teleconferencing can be quite accommodative in a lot of ways. So and again, I come back to sort of the spirit of at least what I understand of the AODA, and I'll admit that I'm not an expert by any means, but the spirit of the AODA is that you will ask how you can help somebody. Ask what kind of services or alternative methods of delivering a service you can do to support people and persons with disabilities. And so I think that's important. If you get a question, someone's having difficulty accessing your meetings, then ask them how you can help. Ask them how you can, you know, what services have they used in the past, and be prepared to explore those in a really honest and genuine way.
Okay. The interesting question, I pose this one to you, Fred. The clerk of the Township of Manitowoc, or deputy clerk, has said, did the mayor and the clerk have to be in attendance together? And how do we get motions signed in advance? Or how do we get motions and bylaws actually signed? That's been our practice. What do we do now? It wasn't quite in those words, but Fred, you wish to comment?
I'll comment on that, but I also want to go up to the last bullet point on the previous question, the confidentiality closed meeting part. With respect to this, we've heard that all members of council potentially could be electronically attending the meeting. There's no requirement for a member to be in the council chamber for the meeting. So you could do it with staff and with council attending an electronic basis. So I think we've heard examples of that and how that can work. With respect to motions, I think clearly we can't get them signed in advance. That's just not going to work. But I think that the head of council is going to have to be clear in asking for a mover of the motion, and that the clerk has to record that name, and similarly for being the seconder. And that will get followed up, and it'll be put into the minutes, and the minutes will reflect that. And if there's an issue with the minutes, that can get dealt with at a subsequent meeting. So,
okay. Well, popping back to your earlier comment, Fred, about let's say we have a 5-member council, they're all on just by teleconference. The quorum's been achieved at the start of the meeting. At some point, you've got to go back and check and make sure the quorum's still there, don't you? Especially if you only had 4 out of 5 attending.
Absolutely.
3 out of 5 attending, right? Periodically, the head has to maintain that. This question comes from John Creelman, who's the deputy mayor of the Township of Mono. So he says, does this mean with the Bill 187 that we can't meet remotely until we've convened normally to attend our procedures? I think what the key element there is until we've convened normally to amend our procedures. Jody, do you want to talk to that one? What 187 actually allows?
The way I read the legislation, the way the amendments are in place is you can meet with electronic participation for the purpose of amending the bylaw to permit electronic participation.
Yeah, this was, they were very, very careful about how they worded this. They were very careful about what they permitted and didn't permit, because they know full well what's in the Education Act with respect to boards of education, electronic meetings, and they clearly decided not to go in that particular direction at this time. We'll see what happens later. We've dealt with those two in a couple of ways. Pardon me for flipping this. The next one, in terms of closing to the public, again, we've talked about that.
Nigel, while you look through the list, can I just go back and talk about the closed meetings?
Go right ahead.
Because I think it's a really significant issue. This has been one of the really big issues over the years, and when people talked about allowing electronic attendance at meetings. And the fear, the risk is you don't know who's in the room with the member, and the consequences could be pretty substantial. The province has recognized, I think, that we're in unique circumstances, and the rules have to apply to closed meetings that are properly called under 239. I think one of the things that everyone needs to take a look at is your code of conduct for members. It has to have, under the regulation, it has to have provisions for confidentiality. And I think if you have someone else in the room with you, that's a breach of the code, or very well may be a breach of your code of conduct. You need to be cautious. And I think there's an obligation on staff, probably clerks particularly, to remind people, members at every single meeting, that when you move into the closed session, you can only be there by yourself. And perhaps the chair, Nigel and I were chatting about this yesterday, perhaps the chair has to ask every member that they are on their own, and confirm themselves that they are in fact indeed on their own, other than having staff there as well. Need to treat this one really carefully. If we're talking about enhanced transparency and accountability, this is a biggie, in my opinion.
Oh, good point. We did have a question from a spouse of a counselor saying, so if my spouse is attending, do I have the right as a member of public to be in the room where my spouse is attending the meeting? And my comment back was, if your spouse gives you permission to be in the room, that's not necessarily where the meeting's taking place. However, it was a bit of a, I think it was meant as a bit of a chuckle. The next question is, will a podcast of this meeting be available? And the answer to that is yes, for those who weren't able to attend. We have a couple of questions that are coming in as we're going along. One comment, in fact, said, we did not, in Clarington, we passed a bylaw to not permit delegations at this time. And that presumably were delegations on general matters, which again, it's part of your procedure bylaw, whether you permit or not. This other one asked for a legal opinion, and we know we're not going to be giving a legal opinion here. However, the question is raised around statutory proceedings under the Planning Act and timelines and deadlines. And we know that there was a regulation. Jody, do you want to speak to where that is now and what you think we need to do in order to abide by it, or what we need to wait for?
Sure, Nigel, and I'm glad you've clarified that we're not going to be providing a legal opinion on this or any issue, but this one bears some careful attention by everybody on their own, seeking their own inputs and interpretation on this. This is a regulation that was released Friday night, quite late, I believe, and there's still a lot of discussion about its interpretation and whether what I'll call the pause on limitation periods in court proceedings and in various matters applies if and how it applies to a wide array of statutory provisions that impact municipalities. And in that wide array, and Stephen, I'll look to your comments as well, can be things under things like the Planning Act, the Heritage Act, MFIPA, PHIPA, the Drainage Act. What about when you have to timelines under the Drainage Act to meet? Everybody should be paying attention to that and considering what this legislation may mean. I don't have a final concrete, this isn't an A or B like the electronic meetings perhaps, where here's the clear rules of how you can allow electronic participation. This one's a little less clear.
Okay. Yeah, I don't know if there's much else to add to what other than what Jody has said. I think that we're in a holding pattern is, I guess, the best analogy I could use here. I think that reg that Jody speaks about, I think it's 7520 under the Emergency Management Civil Protection Act. But the one that came out late last week, it adds a bit of clarity, but not nearly enough. And I think that this is something that we need to get a little bit more clarity on with respect to those public statutory planning meetings. So I don't know if there's a lot of great advice right now. Yeah.
Not to nitpick, but just in case people go to look it up, it's 7320, OREG 7320. And people can read it for themselves and they can seek advice from their municipal solicitor if they wish. That's if you wish legal advice, that's the proper place to get it. Here's another question. And this raised an interesting question I was talking with a municipal CAO about, in fact. It says, during the state of emergency, which issues should be addressed by council and which should be addressed by the emergency response group as designated in our emergency plan? In fact, can we change the composition of that emergency response group to include all members of council? Or would that be some kind of and then it goes on to a couple of other issues. If you declare a local emergency, then your emergency plan comes into play. Number one, do you have to declare a local emergency in order to implement Bill 187? Stephen?
Yeah, that's a great question. My answer to that is no. There's no need for a local emergency to be declared by the head of council to follow through on the provisions that are now allowed under Bill 187. Generally speaking, those declarations by heads of council, I mean, at one time, I think it was also used sort of as a means to access funding from the province through ODRAP. That's not necessarily the case anymore. Really, I think that I mean, we declared an emergency in Guelph last night. I think that the best rationale and reason for declaring an emergency is it can enact that plan that you spoke about, Nigel, and it sort of kicks that into action in a very formal and deliberative way. Some municipalities have sort of stages or tiers of those emergency responses, which allow for sort of like a phase one or a tier one of the emergency operation group to get together and begin to hear things. That's what we were operating under Guelph. But we had a meeting on Monday, and just yesterday, last night, Mayor Guthrie here in Guelph declared an emergency. And so the two are not tied together.
But the emergency that you passed the amendments to your procedure bylaw was the provincial emergency as declared by the Premier. That's one you were working under, right?
That's correct.
Jody, did Halton declare an emergency?
Yes, our regional chair declared an emergency, and that has been done, but again, not with the provincial emergency that permitted the use of the Bill 187 powers at that point in time.
Okay. I think Stephen made a good point about the plans. I've seen some other plans just recently that in fact, some have broad delegation authority to staff under certain circumstances. Others don't have any delegation of authority to act, except for some limited response by the emergency response group. I think it makes a lot of sense to take a look at your emergency plan and say, gosh, given what we know now, does the emergency plan work in the kinds of emergencies or this kind of an emergency?
Nigel, I think one thing that you want to think about, first of all, I'll clarify that the local emergency had been declared by our chair prior to the meeting, but the reports were written sort of just before that. So the provincial emergency allows that to happen.
Yes.
About the participation of members of council in the question about could all members of council be participating on the emergency control group or your emergency group, I would think you'd want to also be mindful and cautious of what is a meeting.
That's right.
And
the real question is, does the emergency response group under your emergency plan actually require members of council to be on it in order for it to be effective? Fred, any comment on the emergency response? No?
No, we're seeing different rationale, different parts of the province, and I've heard some people say we're declaring it locally because we want to really make the point to our residents that this is important in our community, and it's, so we're seeing it happen in both directions.
Right, and that question came from Emily Charlie, who's a councillor in the town of Cobourg, and she said, should we be considering later on amending our emergency plan to better tailor it to include more open and transparent decision-making procedures? I think you'll be able to answer that question as you go on, Emily. Thanks very much. That's all. That's important. We've got another 10 minutes, and let's see what we can do here. Given that we cover some of these, we've already covered some of these as we went along. This one's from Annalene McRobb, who's the acting clerk in the town of Minto. She says, we'll be meeting by teleconference only for council meetings. And I'm working on amending a draft amended procedure bylaw. Can I have it that council, by having no negative vote on a resolution, that the resolution is carried instead of a recorded vote? If so, would you have the wording for that? So that's this is a practice that used to be followed when I worked with the City of London. Fred, the mayor would call for those opposed, and if didn't see a majority opposed, would carry the motion, would declare the motion carried. Do you think that kind of practice is appropriate when you're on teleconference?
Me? No.
Okay, good. So it's a very clear answer, Annalene. Stephen?
Yeah, I'm with Fred on that. I think unique times. I think you've got to sort of be clear. Yeah.
Jody, clarity is important.
Clarity is important. And again, I think clerks are really good at writing out plans and procedures and contingencies and how things are done. I think about the work clerks do with elections and writing out things step by step. I think those skills will hold you in good stead during this time.
Yeah. Yeah, my experience has been so far in this emergency situation that clerks and other municipal staff have been very creative in how they've responded to working remotely, how they responded to keeping their employees safe, but keeping the business of the municipality and the operations to continue, because we have to keep the roadworks moving. We've got to keep the water issues going. We've got to keep sewage treatment going. We've got to keep storm sewers going, garbage collection. There's a lot of operations that are still continuing in a very significant way. It's not as if everybody's working from home. Many municipalities or municipal staff are still out there in their primary locations, but in a safe way. This one is from let's see, it's interesting. The main theme of the initial questions were all about physical location. And I think we've dealt with that in a number of ways. This one says, this is Kira Hayes, the supervisor of corporate affairs in Halton County. She said, what's the best way to keep council informed and on message? Should we be doing end of day updates? Should we be doing daily key messages? Stephen, Jody, what's happening in Halton and Guelph in terms of keeping councillors up to date, given that you aren't having people drop in and there aren't regular meetings of council committees, or frequent ones anyway? Stephen?
Yeah, I'll take a stab. Sure, Nigel. I think that falls to the emergency operations group. I also think that heads of council have an important role to play in emergency events like this. The EMCPA talks about their ability to declare an emergency, but they play a really important role in being the conduit through which information comes from an emergency control group and is shared with other members of council. Members of council need to be in the community to be able to be talking to residents and directing them to where good information can be found and factual information can be found and timely information. And I think it's really incumbent on most likely your mayor, perhaps also your CAO, to be sharing updates. I know in Guelph, we're getting as a staff group regular updates from our executive team on a wide range of issues, even things like mental health. I mean, working in isolation is going to have an impact on people's mental health, and that's important to be there for people, your colleagues, your friends, members of council. So we're seeing those messages, but those messages also need to be tailor fit for members of council so that they're aware of what decisions are being made, what the rationale was, et cetera, et cetera. And I think the role there is for the mayor and likely also a CAO or city manager.
Jody, you're going to have communication staff at Halton, but do you want to comment on what's rolling out from Halton, both to the public and internally?
Yeah, and I think I want to echo what Stephen said too. I mean, I think when I go back to basics, council has one employee, right? That would be the CAO or when there is a CAO or a city manager structure. So that's the communication up and the communication down. And I know our CEO has been fantastic with putting out messages to staff and keeping everybody apprised. Yes, we are fortunate to have a wonderful communication staff here at Halton Region. They too, like IT, are the rock stars of this and have been working very hard, but working on communications, not just for staff and council, but for members of the public, for our community, providing clear, concise, relevant and timely information in formats that are easy to understand, that are accessible in a variety of ways, but it's really that clarity of communication. There's so much being thrown at people right now from all sorts of sources, media, social media, all sorts of messages coming across. If you can make sure your messages as a municipality to all of your stakeholders are clear, are, as Stephen said earlier, listening to the best advice of our public health officials, your medical officer of health, locally, right on up. I think those are really important messages to make sure that you make them understandable and clear.
We've got about 3 minutes until the closing time, and this podcast will be recorded and posted, or not podcast, webinar will be posted and recorded. And I believe the communications one that was facilitated by Brian Lambie from Red Brick Communications for AMO will also be posted or is available online on AMO's website. So I'd like to give you each some time for closing remarks. Stephen, you wish to go first?
Sure, no problem, Nigel. I think my closing remarks would be it's new territory. It's unknown ground that we're sort of treading on, and I think take the time to do a couple of things. I think Jody's point is really key, and I mentioned earlier, heed the advice of public health officials. This is a public health emergency we're in, so that to me should be first and foremost. Social distancing is incredibly important today, so heed that advice. Secondly, liaise with people that you know can offer support. So if you have an in-house IT, that's fantastic. They probably have some good resources. If you don't, which many of you will not have, find someone who's tech savvy. Try things out. Try things out in a way that you're not doing it with council for the first time. Don't be afraid to be iterative and iterate and try new things. If it doesn't work, try something else and go through sort of that pathway. And the final thing I would say is I really like Fred's comment. Nothing in Bill 187 says that you have to have had a meeting this past week or next week or even the week after. Take the time to figure it out. Take the time to make sure that you're comfortable. And quite frankly, take the time to support the elected people that you work with so that they feel comfortable as well.
Good. Thank you. Jody?
I think on top of everything Stephen said, I think the other thing is be confident. You're doing this, you're skilled, you're smart. There's lots of resources available, and don't reinvent the wheel. Reach out and talk to your colleagues. Opportunities like today, there's lots of other resources available. I know not everybody has a lot of time. Ask your neighbors, talk to your colleagues in your local area, talk to other municipalities. Be confident in what you're doing. Document. That's always one of my things I tend to live by. Document everything and go easy on yourself. Not everybody goes 100 miles an hour all the time. Rest when you need to. This has been a long few weeks and there's more coming. So take the time to take care of yourself and your family and your colleagues throughout this.
Fred, you've been through almost 14 days or just over 14 days of social isolation.
Just 14 now. going out for a walk later today and zigzag up and down the street to avoid people walking, but it's good to get out. My final comment is that council has a role in all this. And I think it's important, if you're an elected official, not to say, oh, well, we're just going to let staff handle all this. I think council has a real role. You have to work through the technology part. You have to do what is capable within your community, but you have to govern. You've been elected to govern, and you need to take that seriously. And as Stephen said, you've got to be, all of us have to be creative in terms of how we provide that service to our community. It's really important. Municipalities and municipal government are a series of networks. We network, everybody networks in municipal government. It's fantastic. You develop relationships and it really becomes important. That's true on the staff side, but it's true on the elected side as well. So I agree with Jody. Reach out to people, don't reinvent the wheel. Listen, I'm thrilled that we had a number of people sitting in today, and I've seen a couple of comments saying good tips. That's what this is all about. So council has a real role to play, in my experience.
Okay. Thanks, Fred. Jody, Stephen, Fred, on behalf of AMO and on behalf of everybody who is listening into the conversation here today, thank you very much for your insights, for your thoughtfulness, for your preparation, and for being willing to share it with everyone. My understanding is that AMO will be posting this for anyone to observe. Also, that as the need arises, AMO will post additional webinars and or written material depending on the need and the circumstances. So once again, thank you. We're over our allotted time, and everyone wash your hands and stay safe. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.